Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I'm Jason Marzak, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Adrian Arce Latin America Center. Thank you for joining us for this really important and timely virtual conversation. As all of you know who are tuning in on September 4th, Chileans cast their ballots to reject a new draft constitution written by the democratically elected Constitutional Convention. With over 61% voting to reject the bill and a voter turnout of 64%, Chile will continue with its reformed 1980 legal charter. The constitutional reform process began in 2020 with nearly 80% of Chileans voting in favor of drafting a new constitution that responded to the demands of the 2019 protests. On Sunday, however, only 38% of Chileans voted in favor of this new legal charter. Our conversation today will analyze these results, evaluate their impact in Chile and the implications they have beyond national borders, as well as, most importantly as well, what's the next steps? What happens next and what has been happening in the last few days, even since the vote on Sunday? For the Adrian Arce Latin America Center, this conversation is important as we continue to provide insight and thinking on the direction of Chile, but also the region at this time of critical shifts in policy and direction across Latin America and the Caribbean and frankly around the world. And we have an all-star lineup of speakers to help us do so today. I am absolutely delighted that we have Juan Gabriel Valdez, the ambassador of Chile to the United States, who thankfully returned recently to Washington as ambassador just a few months ago, having previously served from 2014 to 2018. Ambassador Valdez, a real honor and privilege to have you with us today.
Thank you very much, Jason.
Ambassador, we will begin with a fireside conversation with you on the results, and then we'll move into a panel discussion. And for awareness, the panel discussion afterwards will include three excellent speakers. Joining us from Madrid will be Andres Velasco, the Dean of the School of Public Policy at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and also former Finance Minister of Chile. Andres, welcome. And then tuning in from Chile, we have Diana Kruger, the Dean of the School of Government at Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez, and Eugenio Tironi, partner and founder of Tironi, who also teaches the School of Government of the Catholic University and is a regular columnist for the newspaper El Recordio. So thank you all for joining us for this incredibly important conversation. And Ambassador Valdez, let me begin with our one-on-one conversation and ask you the question of the day. What is your vision on the results of the plebiscite? And also importantly, what would you like those tuning in today to best understand about the results that go beyond the headlines?
Well, the first thing to say, I think, is that Chile was once again an example of democratic politics, and that a situation which was difficult to solve, a situation which has evolved from a popular uprising that led the country to a very critical situation at the end of the Piñera government, was solved through a process of first a constitutional convention, and then a process of approval or rejection of a plebiscite last Sunday. Of course, as some people have said about the plebiscite and about the process in total, in general terms, Chile always surprising. In fact, the fact is that nobody expected, probably when the Constitutional Convention began its work, that the result of the last plebiscite would be the one that was given by the Chileans on Sunday. But we are proud of the perfect timing of the process. The massive attendance showed the massive participation in the process. As you have mentioned, there were more than 13 million citizens voted with a participation of 85%. And there were no objections to the results. The president spoke that same night recognizing the results. The fact is that Chile continues to be a country that can solve its problems through democratic means. Now, I don't want to say with this that the campaign was not polarized, that the debate was not difficult and tough, that there was many calls to moderation went mostly unheard. And there is an impact of the way in which the campaign was developed on the result and on the future debates on the plebiscite that we have to wait for them. And the result has had important consequences. As you know, the president changed his cabinet, and he has introduced important changes in the political area of the cabinet, including figures that were relevant during the government of the old Concertación. The two ministers, two women, represent center-left parties. Therefore, there has been already a result of the vote on Sunday, and probably the most important thing is that all parties have concluded that they need to join forces in order to continue with the constitutional process and create a new constitution that will this time represent a majority of Chileans. I would say that this is the general panorama that we have in front of us, and the main purpose is to reduce uncertainty, to create trust in the institutions, to renew the trust on institutions, and create a good reaction to what the Chileans approved. The Chileans voted clearly that they want a new constitution, but not the one proposed by the Constitutional Convention.
You know, Ambassador, I just want to pick up on one thing you said, which is so important for Chile's role in the broader regional context and global context, is the strength of the Chilean democracy, right? And the strength of the voting on Sunday, but also the lead up to the vote, and the fact that Chile has once again shown itself as a leader in democracy and democratic processes and democratic governance. And that is, in addition to the actual results of the plebiscite on Sunday, incredibly important for the role of Chile. You were mentioning the unity following the vote. How do you foresee the continuity of the constitutional reform process?
Well, what you have just said is very important, Jason, because in fact, democracy is under threat in most parts of the world. Therefore, we shouldn't take lightly the fact that a country in the southern part of the world decides to approve a constitution, rejects the constitution, the government is affected, by the government recognizes immediately the results, and the following day, all parties meet in order to see how the new process can be launched, which this time would end up in a positive result for the whole country. Therefore, I think that it is right to underline this fact. Now, in terms of the process that will take place, the only thing we know by now is that in a meeting the following day of the plebiscite, the president has given Congress the task of adopting a new constitutional itinerary. And the objective is to elect a new constitutional convention, which will have a short time, not a long time. Where I cannot be precise on the time. They have spoken about 6 months or something like that, in order to produce a new text that this time will represent the opinion of a substantive majority of the country. There is also talking about the possibility of reuniting a group of experts that will accompany or will go along with the members of the new constitutional convention. But I think that what is most important is that all political parties in the country share the same interpretation of what Chileans voted last Sunday, something I already said. We want a new constitution, not the one that was approved during Pinochet. We want a new constitution which represents all Chileans, not the one that was proposed by this convention. This is exactly the point, and I think that what I have heard and the type of approach that the government has taken, which is to say, we are not going to influence the process, we are not going to participate directly in the process, we want to cooperate with those with the process and with the itinerary, but it is not we who conducts the process, it's the convention once it is elected, but for the moment it's the parliament, the Congress.
Thank you, Ambassador. Let me shift to your role in particular as Chile's ambassador here in Washington. Lucky to have you just down the street here. And your experience leading Chile's diplomatic relationship with the United States has generated incredible impacts on U.S.-Chile ties and will continue to do so in the future. And your return to D.C. this summer on your second appointment to the United States demonstrates the value of your contributions to the bilateral relationship. From your perspective as ambassador, but having also represented Chile and Spain and Argentina and the United States, the United Nations, how did the results of the plebiscite influence Chile's role in the region and also the world? We started to talk about that a little bit, but I'd like to get your further perspective on what the results mean and what the future means for Chile's broader relationships and role.
I think that the foreign policy of the United States and of Chile is based on respect to democracy, and particularly during the last 2 or 3 days, the Biden administration has underlined the importance of democracy in the links and the relationship with the hemisphere. Therefore, what we have just gone through is a confirmation of the capacity of Chile to have an open dialogue on democracy and on the importance of democracy in the hemisphere with the United States. As you know, next year we are going to celebrate 200 years of our relations. And this is a very important moment, not only to look at our history and what happened during our history. Some of the events of our history are not something that we are going to celebrate together, but what we want is to look to the future. And in the future, the two countries need to be much closer in many areas which are important and which are extremely important to this government. This has to do with the development of the transformation of our economies into clean economies, investments on areas which are important for a new type of energy. I'm talking about green hydrogen, ammonium, and other possibilities that Chile opens, like lithium. These we are going to talk about practical things, but these practical things are established on a base which is extremely essential, which is the base of the same principles. We share the same principles of respect for human rights and the principles of democracy. I think this is what Chile is not only saying to the United States, it's demonstrating to the whole hemisphere.
We've also spoken about not only 200 years next year, but also 20 years since the implementation of the free trade agreement between the U.S. and Chile, which is so fundamental to underpinning our ties.
That's right. That's right. We are going to celebrate 20 years of our trade agreements, and therefore we need to go further than the American Partnership for Economic Prosperity that has been proposed in Los Angeles. We received a proposal which we need to push further. I'm very happy to say that Secretary Blinken is visiting Chile in the first days of October, and we will be able to launch this conversation further during the next months, particularly probably during the visit of President Boric to the United Nations in 2 weeks. Therefore, the relationship is going through a very good moment, and I think that the plebiscite and the democratic example that has just been given only solidify and strengthen our links with this country.
Couldn't agree more with you, Ambassador. Thank you so much for joining us today for this really timely and important conversation.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you for being here. I want to now move on to a broader conversation with our other invited guests. Again, delighted to have with us today Andres Velasco, the Dean of the School of Public Policy and former of the London School of Economics and Political Science and former Minister of Finance of Chile. Diana Kruger, the Dean of School of Government at the Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez, and Eugenio Tironi, partner and founder of Tironi, who also teaches at the School of Government at the Catholic University and a columnist for El Mercurio. We're gonna first start on the vote itself, and then move to the global and regional implications, and then importantly focus on what's next. And Andres, I want to begin with you. As I was just speaking with Ambassador Valdez, when President Piñera proposed to draft a new constitution in Chile in 2020, there was a widespread agreement with the initiative. But the results from Sunday were the reversed with regard to the document that eventually came out of that process. Why do you think the option to reject the Constitution won by such a large margin? And from your perspective, what happened that so drastically changed people's trust in the document that was eventually presented for a vote?
Hello, Jason. Hello, everyone. Thanks for the invitation. Very happy to be joining Eugenio and Diana, two dear friends. I think there are two questions, Jason, which I would keep separate. One is, do people in Chile want a new constitution? And I think the answer is yes. And that's exactly why 78.5 or 6% 2 years ago in the initial plebiscite, yes, let us write a new constitution. A second and very different question is whether the particular text that was put to a vote on Sunday was a good text or a bad text. And my personal view is that it was a bad text. It was partisan. It did not do the job of building a strong political system for Chile's future. It was way too long. It was confusing. It would have necessitated years of implementing legislation and years of litigation. And so it cannot be so surprising if a very large majority of Chileans, nearly 2 out of 3, said, yes, we want a new constitution, but we don't want this particular constitution. And I would underline one more thing. This was not a vote of old against young, poor against rich, Santiago against the regions. For the non-Chileans among us, Chile has 16 regions. The no vote won in every single one of the 16 regions. Chile has 346 municipalities, and the no vote won in 338. That is to say, only 7 municipalities out of nearly 350 voted to approve the constitution. And, you know, the hip enclave of Ñuñoa in central Santiago voted yes to the constitution, but almost every single low-income municipality in the country, north, south, and center, voted against the text. For a constitution that attempted to enshrine indigenous rights, and let me underline that is a noble and necessary task, but of course, how you do it matters. It is quite striking that if you look across Chile at regions and municipalities with larger indigenous populations, those are also exactly the regions and municipalities where there was most opposition to the text. So I could go on, but I shall not. Let me simply summarize. This has not changed the overall perception that the 1980 Constitution is dead and we need a new one, but we now have a chance to write a better one, and I'm pretty hopeful that's exactly what will happen.
Andres, I want to bring Diana in a moment, but let me ask you first a follow-up question. Why do you see, you mentioned the voting tendencies with areas of the country with high indigenous populations? Why do you think that particular result played out with regard to the vote on Sunday? Andres, you're on mute.
Oh, I thought you had turned to Diana already. For 2 reasons. The first one is that there was a very visible disconnect between the priorities of the majority of people writing the convention and the priorities of middle class and working class citizens of Chile. And that is most evident when it comes to crime and violence. It was quite striking that for the first 3 weeks of its operations, the convention did not begin writing a new constitution. They began trying to put pressure on the government to grant a blanket amnesty to people who had been involved in violent acts in October and November 2019. Similarly, the regions of the country with big pockets of indigenous populations, and most obviously the region of Araucanía and the adjoining provinces north and south of there, have been the regions of Chile most clearly affected by violence. Violence which almost day after day involves the burning of trucks, the burning of property, attacks that have grown increasingly violent, and a number of instances, fortunately not too many so far, in which human beings have lost their lives because they've been caught in a burning building or they've been shot at with machine guns. And I think that if you live in New York and write for the New York Times, maybe that doesn't seem too terrible, it's far away. If you live nearby, it seems like a real threat to the welfare of your family. Yeah. And so it is not so surprising that people nearby felt that this is an issue that needs to be dealt with, and the Constitution was not dealing with in the appropriate way. Now, none of that, let me emphasize, stands in the way of affirming the fact that Chile has a long history of discrimination against an abuse of indigenous populations, and we need a new social contract with indigenous populations. But again, that could be done well, that could be done poorly, and my personal view is that the previous document did not get that right.
Thank you, Andres. As I'm moving on to Diana for your insight, want to remind everybody joining us that you can feel free to, if you're joining via Zoom, feel free to ask your question using the Q&A function and the Zoom feature, and I'll bring those questions in during the conversation, or perhaps bring some in toward the end of the conversation. If you're watching over Twitter, feel free to direct your question to @AC.M. We'll bring your questions into the conversation as appropriate. Diana, what are your thoughts on this change in behavior, and from your opinion, what may have been specifically lacking in the drafting process?
Thanks, Jason, and hello to everyone. Thanks to the Atlantic Council and the Area and Arts Center for inviting me. I agree with what Andres said. What I would add is I believe that the new draft was rejected for two broad reasons. One that has to do with the text itself, and Andres just mentioned some of the problems. And another one, I believe, had to do with the convention itself, the whole process. So I just want to add one more issue regarding the text itself. I think we shouldn't forget that the reason that we are where we are today started with a social uprising in October 2019, and that the demands behind that movement, there's been a lot of studies about this, was mostly due to inequalities in socioeconomic aspects of people's lives. So low pensions, poor health services, etc. And so what I view is that there was a disconnect between the issues that received most attention by the convention and the concern of the majority of citizens. The reason why the movement was received such support, 80% of the population almost voting for a new constitution, with the hope that the new constitution would be more flexible and would make deep reforms to address those socioeconomic needs. So as the convention progressed, the discussion and the issues that were discussed were really far from average citizens' lives. Agreeing with what Andres said, that there are also a long historical debt to recognize Chile's multiculturalism and the rights of indigenous people. And the other issue that became very criticized was the way that elected conventional representatives behaved themselves in ways that were very distant from the average citizen. So Andres mentioned the first few weeks, the demands for amnesty at a time of growing violence in the South. Also, there was some actions against the national anthem that, many people might agree with such symbols of protest, but it was very far from the average citizen. So I think those two, and that was just one example, of specific behaviors by some of the people in the convention, and it became difficult to bring those elected conventionals to the center throughout the whole process. So I think if one looks at the polls, the convention itself lost support quite early in the process, and it was not able to regain that. It fluctuated up and down, but it never regained the support that it had at the beginning.
And thereby, because of that lack of support from the beginning, the lack of support for the eventual document that many people saw as, even though wanting, as Andres was saying and Ambassador Valdez, wanting the change, not being happy with the 1980 Constitution, but just seeing the Constitution that was eventually put forward is really not reflecting Chileans' desires and where they want to take the country, where you want to take the country.
Yes, that's right. For many people, they were one and the same, or support for the text. I think they're two separate things. They're related. I'm sure that in the next few years, we're going to see a lot of studies that want to understand, what, how much was due to what. In economics, we call this an identification problem. It'll be very difficult to separate these two effects, but I believe that they are intertwined, and that's why we saw the results that we saw last Sunday.
Well, Henry, I want to move on to you to help us finish looking at the results from Sunday before we move on to the important question of looking at what's next, which is already starting to see a lot of movement in just the last few days. But just sticking first off with the results from Sunday before we go on to that broader analysis. Before the vote, the polls projected a 7 to 10% point difference, but it ended up being over 20%. From your experience working in public opinion and polling, why do you think the result of the Rechazo won by such a larger than expected point average?
Thanks for the invitation. I will say first, as Andres said before, that the question in the first plebiscite of 2020 was about was completely different than last Sunday. Last Sunday was, do you want this proposal? And it's very difficult to approve because you must buy it all. And in the other case was, do you want a new constitution? And so it was completely different. But I think that the polls are showing now what were the main reasons the people had. I think that we cannot, we don't need to overinterpret this as we did with October 2019. But being very conservative, we know, first of all, as Diana said, the lack of confidence in the convention. The convention was formed mostly by ordinary people, not from Santiago, half of them women, with seats of with native people. They were very aggressive towards elite, toward Chilean symbols, towards Chilean old institutions, and they were more oriented to show their identities than to work in a new constitution. And they excluded the right and the center from any kind of agreement. They were completely blind about what was happening in Chile. For instance, inflation, violence, crime, and so on. And there was not leadership, political leadership inside the convention from the main actors that were inside the left, the Frente Amplio and the Communist Party. And specifically, it was very strongly rejected the idea of plurinational state. This affects the heart of the Chilean identity and the Chilean dream. We feel ourselves an homogeneous population, mixed race, organized around a centralized state. And this is what makes the difference between us and mainly the Andean countries. So what the Constitution was proposing was to become more Andean and less European. That was not a very good thing to sell. And also the poll shows that for the people, the new constitution was a new source of instability. And the people they don't want more sources of instability. They have inflation, crime, violence. So that was very important. And I would like to add also that there was a very intelligent campaign from the right, from the beginning. The right officially voted against a new constitution in the first referendum. We cannot forget that. And from the day one of the convention, they sell the idea that this was not going to work with this kind of people, with this kind of behavior. And they had very good examples to show, and they show it very, very intelligently from the first day one. So the fact that the people didn't trust to the convention was something that was produced by the conventionals, but also by a very intelligent campaign. And last but not least, this was a reaction to the government and to the political class. This plebiscite under Piñera, as was originally planned, will lead probably to the win of the April. But under Boric, with inflation, crime and violence, with the opposition of the government of the retirement of the 10% a few months ago of the pension funds, and with the end of government aids to the people, was a cocktail that was very difficult to approve. So the people showed the rejection to political class, to the elites, saying no.
Eugenio, a follow-up question for you on looking at the results and the voting trends. When you look at the voting trends, one thing interesting is looking at the apruebo voters that were predominantly young, under 35 years old, and also concentrated in certain geographic locations. As Andres mentioned, the apruebo won in only 8 of the 346 municipalities in Chile, most of them within or near the metropolitan region. How do you explain those trends in the vote on Sunday?
I think yes, that's true, but was not the pattern which we saw in the Boric election, for instance. This was very massive, and I will say transversal, the vote of the reaction. In general, they won in all the country, as Andres said, in every region, rural and urban, rich and poor, north, south, and center, with no gender differences, and also the young people voted in a majority for the reaction and not for the approval. But in some sense, this is I would say the reaction of the old generation, that they felt themselves very bad because of this very arrogant new generation that came to power, and who used the convention as, I will say, as the church of the new ideas that they wanted to introduce to Chilean society. And the people, the common people, say no.
Yeah.
And this is something that we saw it in the Brexit, for instance, or in Colombia. The common people, but not so massively as we saw it here in Chile, because I think probably the other alternative was more reasonable than here. So the people say no to all this young, middle, cosmopolite class who was saying us to take into account more the planetary challenges than the poverty and crime and violence.
Thank you, Eugenio. I want to move on to what's next, and Andres, begin with you. After the results were announced, as Ambassador Valdez was sharing at the beginning, President Bort went ahead and had a number of changes in the leadership of different ministries: Interior, Social Development, Health, Energy, Science. And the president's also engaged in a narrative of unity, saying immediately after the votes, beyond the legitimate differences, I know that the desire for dialogue and meetings prevails. We continue, we will move forward. From Andres, what does this mean for the future of Bort's presidency, as he's navigating these different views, and also this moment of, I think, of rejection of the obviously the rejection of the text from the electorate, but as the electorate still wants, as we're discussing, still wants change, and how does he navigate that, and what are going to be the most immediate next steps, beginning with what we've been seeing already this week? And Andres, you're on. Yeah, there you go.
Great question. I will take 30 seconds before tackling your question to add one thought to something very important that Eugenio said. And I think I will add it because it might resonate also with people in the audience who may be in the US or in Europe. We have seen often in politics in the West that middle-class voters, working-class voters are turned off by what sounds like, I will use a controversial term, woke priorities. And this is not only true in the US. I was in France when President Macron tried to tax diesel, and the head of the Gilets jaunes said, the president is worried about the end of the planet. I am worried about getting to the end of the month. So we've seen it in France. We clearly saw it in the US and the events leading to the terrible election of Donald Trump as president of the United States. Chile is not alone in this. There's a disconnect in the agenda, in the priorities of a good chunk of the cosmopolitan left and the priorities of the person who's worried about paying bills, sending kids to school and making it to the end of the month. What comes next? I think the news is good, and I don't want to sound like I'm over optimistic, but first of all, a broad spectrum of political parties agree on the fact that this is the second stage of the constitutional process. It is not the end. You know, to paraphrase Churchill, this is not the beginning of the end, it's just the end of the beginning. And most political parties also agree that the second stage has to consist of a convention, but a different convention. You know, Diana and Eugenio were quite clear in outlining some of the problems of the first convention. You had too many independents, you had too many single issue people who cared about one thing intensely and who had no overall view. Political parties whose job it is to put together deals and operate across trade-offs were very, very weak. You know, experts on politics and political science and constitutional law were mostly not elected, so on and so forth. And therefore, if you tweak the electoral rules of the game, you could have a convention that is smaller, that is more representative, that is more prone to broad agreements, where the key issues of the political system, the electoral system, how presidential do you want to be, how parliamentary do you want to be, you want the electoral system to be more proportional, to be more majoritarian. That's the bread and butter of conventions. And I think a convention elected by a different means could focus on that. On the president and his cabinet, you know, Eugenio and Diana are in Santiago, so maybe they have a more first-hand impression, but I've been on the phone with a lot of people. I think there's also an American way of viewing this. You know, so often when Trump was messing things up, people said, you know, bring some adults into the room. What I think the president of Chile has done is he's brought some adults into the room. He's appointed two highly experienced, highly intelligent, highly qualified women to be at the core of his cabinet. I was privileged to be a minister with both of them in the first Bachelet administration. I know them well. Carolina Toa back then was a spokeswoman for the government. She's now the Minister of the Interior. Analia Uriarte back then was the Minister of the Environment. Today, she is the liaison with Congress. They're very able people. They're not radicals. They are modern social democrats. And I think they will do a good job. And what we need today in Chile is precisely people like them who understand parliamentary dynamics, who understand that nobody knows exactly what the right answer is. You've got to sit down, grab a cup of coffee and negotiate. And I'm pretty confident they will do so, and they will do so well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Andres. Diana, we're talking about everyone's asking what's next. I want to ask you two questions. One is, why do you see the consensus taking shape rather quickly? But then also bring in a question that received over the Q&A, as well as also, from your perspective, what do you see as the best method, taking into account what's transpired over the course of the convention? What do you, and as there is a lot of discussion right now about what is next, what do you see as the best method for writing a new constitution? What are the lessons learned from this process for moving forward?
Yeah, I believe that the election results did not come as a surprise to most people. The polls were showing that the reject option was going to come out on top. So the reason why I believe things have moved quickly is because both sides, the government and the opposition, were expecting this and had their contingency plans discussed, at least amongst themselves. I don't think anyone expected the difference to be so wide. There is discussion now as to whether changes in the cabinet should have been deeper, but for now they have been made, and they were probably being considered even before the results were known. So I think that's what explains the fast results that we are observing. Regarding the question in the chat, not an expert in the design of political mechanisms, but from my limited knowledge, what I would say is that the way forward to avoid if we want to call them mistakes, I don't like to talk about mistakes, but to avoid the experience or the consequence of having a convention with, as Andres and Eugenio also mentioned, so many independents, possibly an over representation of indigenous representatives. But the way forward is to design a mechanism that is representative, that is more reflective of the political forces elected in the Congress today. It was very surprising to everyone and to analysts that the previous convention did not moderate itself when there was an election for Congress right in the middle of their discussions that revealed that Chile is moderate. Chileans are typically moderate, pragmatic. In addition to the comments made by Eugenio and Andres, people are worried about getting to the end of the month. And we have a representative democracy with a body of parliament that is split almost 50-50. So I know that there are very intelligent people right now working and discussing and sitting down for coffee or on the phone, talking about the details of the new rules of the game. And I'm sure that they are going to come out with a proposal, or my hope, maybe I'm being too hopeful, that the new mechanism is more conducive to a balanced new convention, so that the new proposal in 1 year's time, which is a proposed time frame, is acceptable to the great majority of Chileans. I think that is the way forward.
Eugenio, I saw you nodding your head in agreement as Diana was making that point. So if you want to go ahead and elaborate further, that would be excellent. Then I'll follow up with you with an additional question. I can't hear you. There you go.
No. I agree completely. And now is the time for politicians. When the convention was elected, you cannot talk about politicians. That's the reason why it was unanimous in the parliament to allow independents to participate. And it was supported by all the newspapers and everybody, because politicians were, and politicians never liked very much the convention. And now I would say politics and politicians are coming back through the Congress. They are building the rules, and they will have a very, very important role in what's happening. I think that the main challenge today is to arrive to a new proposal of constitution that could win with a 60% of support in a new exit referendum, that we would like to have it before the 50th anniversary of the coup d'etat. This needs, I think, a very honest and a positive participation of the APREO supporters in the new convention, not looking to win in the exit plebiscite, but looking to agree a good text that could win support from the people. And I think the support, the APREO supports must not, I would say, repeat the conduct or the behavior of some of the reject supporters in the convention. And second, I think the new proposal must be produced not against the draft that was rejected last Sunday.
Mhm.
But integrating the main values of that, not the rules, not the regulation, but the values
Yeah.
of that draft. Welfare state, new relations to nature, parity,
Yeah.
full integration of native people, decentralization,
Yeah.
a more participatory democracy. In other words, I think the main responsibility now is from the Rechazo, I would say, supporters. Don't exaggerate, I would say, don't exaggerate the significance of the Rechazo victory, and try to introduce many arguments in that. Avoid arrogance,
Yeah.
but and look for large agreements. If
Eugenio-
we can do that, I think we are going to be very in a new mood, in a new step.
I'm going to turn to Andres, but you just reiterate one of the points you make, Eugenio, is the importance of the fact that the proposed constitution included many changes and reforms that Chileans want. Climate, equality issues, race issues, protection of indigenous and human rights, and so it really begets the question of how to incorporate. And the Rechazo wasn't necessarily rejecting those ideas, but it was about the eventual text. And so, Andre, what's your perspective on what should be the optimal process for getting for the drafting of a new constitution?
Thanks, Jason. A couple words on the process and a couple words on content. I'll give you my personal view on what the process ought to look like, but it's not entirely just my own, because I've been working with a number of people, including some former members of the convention and some members of parliament, on what this might look like. First, retain parity. The new convention ought to have men, have women. That's not something that anybody that I know disagrees with. Secondly, have a system of lists, and ideally of closed lists. Political scientists like to distinguish between open lists, in which a party runs a list, and Jason is number 3 or number 7 or number 19, it doesn't really matter. I vote for Jason. If Jason gets more votes, he's in. In a closed list, which is more common in most European countries, you vote for the list, and then the party is free to put Jason number 1, or if Jason is not a loyal party member, put him in number 27, right? Why is this advisable? Because you reward collective endeavors, visions of what the Constitution ought to look like, as opposed to the popularity of one individual who might be a television star or a football player or a soap opera actor or actress. So I think it's tricky to get this through Parliament, because the idea that you vote for political parties is, as Eugenio was saying, not the most popular. Nobody likes political parties, but this is the way a lot of successful democracies work. Last but not least, and I want to be careful in the way I phrase this, I think we need reserved seats for indigenous peoples, but we want to think about a different way of assigning those seats and a different way of deciding how many seats you have. The problem is this. I've been for assigned seats or reserved seats for a very long time. But if you go back and you look at what happened in the election of the previous convention, if you ran for a regular seat in downtown Santiago, you needed about 40,000 votes to make it to the convention. If you ran for one of the reserved seats for one of the ethnic groups, there was a gentleman who was elected with 42 votes and another person who was elected with 92 votes. So I think a number of citizens said, I'm for reserved seats, but let's be careful here. It cannot be that somebody needs 40,000 votes and somebody needs 40 votes. New Zealand has thought about this problem, and I think come up with a good solution. What the New Zealanders do is you have a minimum of X seats that are reserved for representatives of indigenous people, and you add more seats depending on how many people participate in the election for those seats. So for I don't quite know what the number is, but let me make it up for every extra 50,000 people that participate in that election, you get an extra seat. That way you ensure that nobody will be elected with 40 votes. You have to get 20,000 votes or 10,000 votes or something like that to be elected. That means that you will have reserved seats in the convention, but you will probably have fewer than the 17 than you had before. Last but not least, what you want, I think, is a convention that is a little bit smaller. so that you can, sit around the table and work. And you don't want a year-long mandate. You probably want a 6-long mandate to do exactly what Eugenio said earlier, so that there's time to elect the convention between now and the end of the year, have them work for the first half of next year, have a referendum to say up or down. I hope it will be up in August of next year, and faced September 11th, 2023, the 50th anniversary of the coup, with a new democratic regime and a new constitution. I think that would be wonderful. One very brief thought on content. I just want to agree with something that both Diana and Eugenio said, but this is not what is sometimes being said in the press, so I think it's important to stress it. Chile has moved forward in some fundamental values, and I think there's no going back. Chile has had, for instance, gay marriage in the books. It is legal. It has been since late last year. That is not going to change. Chile has had one convention which was half men, half women. That is not going to change. The deep awareness that we have a history of discrimination and abuse of native and indigenous peoples, and that has to change. I think that's very much built into the DNA of the younger politicians and of many Chilean voters. So the concepts, the values are widely shared. What we need to do the next time around is write a text that implements those values in a workable way. That's what they got wrong the previous time. I'm hopeful we can get it right this time.
Thank you, Andres. I know one thing as well from your comments. I certainly won't get any votes for my football playing skills, but really appreciate the balanced analysis of what can be done moving forward. Diana or Eugenio, if you have any comments. If not, I want to shift Diana to a regional question for you, but I'll leave the space if you have any comments, either one of you, on the points Andres just made. No. Diana, Chile is oftentimes, if we look, we have just a few more minutes here before we have to wrap our discussion in about 7 minutes here, but Chile has often been referred to as the cradle of transformation and also development in the region. It's one of the fastest growing economies over the last 30, 40 years. It's always been viewed as a stronghold for trade and diplomacy. From your perspective, what are the lessons following the results of the plebiscite for other countries in the hemisphere who might be looking at some point about the application of what happened in Chile for their own national context?
That's a really good question. I listened very carefully to Ambassador Valdez's comments at the beginning, so I don't know if I can express them as eloquently as he did, but I do believe that Chile is an example to the region in terms of the strength of its democracy. So, and that is refreshing, living here for so many years. But it is something to consider. I'm not sure how exportable it is. I would hope that we are an example. I think that the whole region, if we want to support democracy, Chile is definitely an inspiration. It's very concerning, for example, what is happening very close by in the upcoming elections for Brazil, for example, where there's threats of not recognizing elections. As the ambassador said, the president recognized the results of the election quite quickly. So that, in terms of the politics, I would hope that the model that Chile has is something that other countries strive for. I think it requires institutional reform and a lot of consensus building, but at least it's something to look toward. Regarding economics, I agree with Eugenio not to overinterpret the results of Sunday, but one aspect regarding the economic dimensions that were put forth in the former draft has to do with Chile's role in the global economy. There was some aspects of the draft that was trying to promote a more regionalist view instead of a global view. I think that has not passed. I'm not sure that it was top of mind in the voters when they made the decision on Sunday. But I do believe that with the rejection from Sunday and with the celebration of Chile's role in the global economy, I think it will maintain its view towards global trade in the future. Of course, this is a matter for policy for the government of turn. I don't know what role this should play, if it should be in a constitution. But regarding your question, I think that the rejection has dispersed those doubts that were coming about, and it has reduced uncertainty, at least in the short run, regarding property rights being questioned a bit in the draft. So the stock market seems to be reacting to that lower uncertainty. The economy is still in difficult shape for this year and next year. So, but at least, there is a little bit of uncertainty that has been reduced.
Eugenia, would you like to comment as well on what you see as the broader regional context? I'm going to end with Andres.
No, I agree with what was said. I think it's very interesting that we have a social breakdown in 2019 that was and Chilean democracy was really in a very bad position, and we find a way to canalize this energy and this malaise through an institutional process. This process needed, I think, needed a catharsis, needed an expressive moment, and that was the convention. And I think that the system tried to integrate people who felt themselves marginalized, that they were the defeated by history. They produced a draft that was rejected, but there are a lot of values inside. That's the reason why I think that looking for social cohesion, the new convention must recognize the effort of the old convention.
Yeah.
The old convention and the people who support them must not feel that they were once again defeated. So I think it's very important to integrate what they had done. And it's very interesting how the way political class is building now a new step in this process, and how quick the president is reacting to this. He's saying, well, the Congress is going to be the scenario of this agreement, and afterwards the convention, and I will move myself to the urgent social problems of Chileans. So he is hearing what the people said on Sunday, and I am changing the coalition in the government. Something that I would say Allende couldn't do between 1970 and 1973. He's changing completely the equilibrium of the government. So I think that in Chile, at the end of the day, something we learn from history.
Thank you, Eugenio. Andres, let me turn to you for the last word here. You're joining us from Madrid, and so if you also want to end with how you're also seeing what might be potentially lacking from the international discussion on the results and also the future of Chile. You're on mute.
I think there are few cases in which the gap has been so big between what the global press were saying and what Chileans were thinking. I'm writing a piece, so I've spent much of last night looking at the coverage by big English language newspapers. Let me give you two quotes. The New York Times gushed that this was the constitution that guaranteed the most rights of any constitution anywhere. The Guardian said it was the most progressive constitution in the planet. Hollywood, of course, was not going to be left out. So the Incredible Hulk chimed in with his own endorsement of the Constitution. And many people who probably had not read the Constitution, lots of glitterati from academia in the North. Parenthetically, I don't think there's an English or French language translation. So I'm always amazed when I see colleagues in the economics or political science discipline whom I know don't speak Spanish pontificating on the Constitution. But, glittering figures were telling Chileans how to vote. Well, Chileans would have none of it. And I think that's healthy. because one thing we don't want to be is we don't want to be the guinea pigs of the musings and the experiments and the desires of people who know very little about our country and who are engaging in virtue signaling from New York or Boston or Paris or California. Having said that, I want to underscore something that Diana said and Eugenio said, which I think is very true. We Chileans are not very chauvinistic in the sense that we're a little shy about talking about Chilean great achievements, but there's one thing that underlines this discussion, and I do want to say it. Our country has shown a talent for politics, and our country has shown a talent for democratic politics. On the 15th of November, 2019, Machu Santiago was either in flames or about to go up in flames. And a bunch of members of Congress, men and women from different parties, said, hey, politics is about finding a way out, changing the conversation, channeling, as Eugenio said, the energy in a different direction. And they did it. And since then, it's been up and down, fits and starts, but we moved from violence to politics. And I think the same thing happened on Sunday. We had a constitutional process. The process, in principle was good. The delivery was bad. And Chileans sort of got to the edge, looked down at the abyss and said, I don't want that. And unlike many other countries in the world, we said no to populism and we said no to demagoguery. And I think that's brilliant. And let me say one last thing, Jason, if I may. I did not vote for President Boric. I did not vote for Cast either. I simply did not vote on that second round. But I've been very, very, very impressed by how he's handled events since the vote. His speech on Sunday night was impeccable. What he's done since, I think, points in the right direction. So from the center, from the left, from the right, there are reasons to be optimistic about the Chilean way out when it comes to politics and democracy.
And as we've discussed, incredibly important message of unity when after such an important vote. And Chile, again, being, as we were going back to my first conversation with Ambassador Valdez, an example to the world of how to work through such difficult questions. I want to again, thank you, Andres, for joining us. Diana, thank you so much. Eugenio, thank Ambassador Valdez for joining us for our initial conversation. I also, Ignacio Ulloa, my team, who organized this incredibly important conversation and also traveled to Chicago to be able to vote at the Consulate of Chile there last Sunday. So please count on us at the Atlantic Council, the Adrian Arch Latin America Center, as we continue to look at these important developments for the region and provide this nuanced insight, analysis, and understanding. With that, have a great rest of the afternoon.